In a remote corner of New England, hidden from tourists and even the locals, there's a forest that doesn't appear on any maps. It's called the Forgotten Forest, and it's known for swallowing anyone who steps inside. Years ago, a boy named Danny disappeared there. He was 8 years old, and he loved stories of monsters and witches. He'd beg his parents to read them every night. Then one day he heard about the Forgotten Forest from some older kids at school. They told him about the strange things that happened there. People going in and never coming out, whispering voices that seemed to call for help, and shadows that lurked just out of sight. They said it was the most haunted place in all of New England. Danny couldn't resist. He snuck out one autumn afternoon, planning to explore the forest just for a few minutes, to see if the stories were true. He was never seen again. His parents searched every inch of the woods, along with the police and half the town, but it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. After a few weeks, the search was called off. Danny's parents moved away, and the forest faded from everyone's memory. The years passed, and the tale of Danny's disappearance became just another ghost story. Then, 30 years later, a girl named Sarah went missing. Sarah was 16, curious and stubborn. She was visiting her grandparents for the summer and had overheard a story in town about Danny and the Forgotten Forest. Her grandparents warned her not to go near it, calling it dangerous and cursed, but the warnings only fueled her curiosity. One crisp October evening, as the sun was setting, Sarah decided to go for a walk and see the forest for herself. She wandered to the edge of the woods, peering between the trees as the last light of day faded. The trees seemed to twist and turn like gnarled fingers, reaching out to pull her in. Sarah felt an eerie chill in the air, but something drew her forward, almost like an invisible hand was guiding her. As she stepped into the forest, the world went silent. No birds, no wind, nothing but her own breathing. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the air grew thick and musty. After a while, Sarah realized she couldn't tell which way she'd come from. She tried to retrace her steps, but every path looked the same. That's when she heard it, a whisper, soft and faint, calling her name. Sarah. She froze, heart pounding. She told herself it was just her imagination, but then she heard it again. Sarah, help me. It was the voice of a child, young and trembling. She turned in circles, trying to find the source. The voice sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest. Please, it said again, this time clearer. I'm lost. Sarah's mind raced. Was it Danny? Was he still out here after all these years? She moved toward the sound, brushing past branches that seemed to reach out and snag her clothes. Finally, she saw something in the distance, a faint, flickering light. It looked like a lantern, bobbing up and down as if someone were carrying it. She hurried toward it, feeling a strange pull, like she was being drawn by some unseen force. As she got closer, the lantern vanished, but she saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a boy, about 8 years old, wearing an old-fashioned jacket and shorts. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, as if he'd been crying for years. "Are you Danny?" she whispered. The boy nodded, his eyes filling with sadness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly. "They don't let you leave." "Who?" Sarah asked, feeling a chill creep up her spine. "The ones who live in the trees," he whispered. "They feed on loneliness. They took me, and now they want you too." Before she could react, she felt something cold and wet wrap around her ankle. She looked down and saw a long skeletal hand reaching out from the earth, its bony fingers curling around her leg. She tried to pull away, but more hands shot out from the ground, grabbing her arms, her legs, pulling her down. The boy watched, his face twisted in sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said. "I tried to warn you." Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the silence of the forest. The hands dragged her down into the earth, and the last thing she saw was the boy's face, fading into darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found Sarah's footprints leading into the forest, but they stopped abruptly in the middle of a clearing. There was no sign of her, just a single piece of torn cloth caught on a branch. Over the years, more people have gone missing in the Forgotten Forest. Some say you can still hear their voices at night, calling for help, trapped between the trees. But no one ever goes looking for them anymore. Because once you enter the Forgotten Forest, you become a part of it. Forever. In a quiet, unassuming suburb, nestled between rows of identical houses, there's a place the locals call the Silent Neighborhood. At first glance, it's no different from any other suburban area. The lawns are neatly trimmed, cars are parked in pristine driveways, and every house looks freshly painted. But if you walk down the street, you'd notice something strange. You'll never hear a sound. There are no barking dogs, no children playing, no lawnmowers buzzing, and no conversations. Even the birds seem to avoid the place. It's like stepping into a photograph of a neighborhood rather than the real thing. A few years ago, a young journalist named Tom moved into a small house on the corner of the street. He'd heard rumors about the silent neighborhood, but he thought they were just urban legends. As a writer looking for fresh stories, he was intrigued. Maybe there was something here he could write about, a weird local tale. Maybe something spooky but harmless. On his first night, he unpacked his boxes and went to bed early, exhausted from the move. Around midnight, he was jolted awake by the sound of faint music. It was coming from outside, something soft and eerie, like an old lullaby. Tom pulled back his curtain and looked out, but the street was deserted, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The music stopped as soon as he looked out. The next day, he shrugged it off as a strange dream. But the following night, just as he was drifting off, he heard it again. A soft melody, weaving through the silence. This time, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, determined to find the source. The moment he closed his door, however, the music faded into silence. Tom walked down the street listening for any sound, but there was nothing. No crickets, no rustling trees. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on him. He shivered, feeling the hairs on his arms stand up, and went back inside, telling himself it was just his imagination. The third night, Tom decided to set up a camera and audio recorder by his window. He let it run all night, determined to catch something. When he reviewed the footage the next morning, he was startled. The camera showed nothing but his empty street, bathed in eerie quiet. But the audio recording was a different story. At exactly 3:07 a.m., a faint whisper crackled through the speakers. It was too soft to make out, but it sounded like someone or something was saying his name, over and over again. That afternoon, Tom decided to talk to his neighbors, hoping they'd have an explanation. He walked down the street, knocking on doors, but no one answered. Not a single door opened. He could see curtains twitching as people peered out, but no one acknowledged him. It was as if they were watching him, silently, like he was the stranger in a place where he didn't belong. Finally, an elderly woman across the street opened her door just a crack and beckoned him over. She looked around nervously before whispering, "You need to leave, young man. They don't like it when people ask questions." "Who doesn't like it?" Tom asked, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. She hesitated, glancing down the street as if afraid someone would overhear. "The ones who live here," she whispered. "They're not like us. They're different. They keep the neighborhood silent because they can't stand noise. They used to live where there were no sounds at all, no light, no laughter, just endless dark silence." Tom stared at her, a skeptical smile creeping onto his face. This was sounding like the beginning of a horror novel. "And who are they exactly?" She shook her head, her eyes wide and fearful. "They're shadows, echoes of something else. I don't know what they are, but if you don't leave soon, you'll become one of them." Before he could ask more, she shut the door in his face. Tom went back to his house, her warning echoing in his mind. He tried to sleep, but a strange anxiety gnawed at him. He kept glancing at the clock, watching as it inched closer to 3:07 a.m. When the time finally came, he held his breath, waiting. And then he heard it. A low, soft voice whispering his name. "Tom, come outside." It was calling him, beckoning him with a chilling familiarity. Against his better judgment, Tom walked to the door, almost as if he were in a trance. He opened it, stepping into the silent night. His street was bathed in a silvery glow, but this time it wasn't empty. Dark figures lined the sidewalks, standing perfectly still. They looked like his neighbors, but something was off. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at him. He tried to turn back, but his body felt paralyzed, as if the air itself was pressing him forward. He felt drawn to them, pulled by an invisible force. And then, in a whisper that filled his mind, he heard them speak. "We were once like you," they said in unison. Curious, eager to understand the unknown. Now we are part of it. The shadows moved closer, their faces twisting, morphing into dark, empty voids. Tom felt his own vision dimming, his body going cold. And in a sudden, terrifying clarity, he understood. This wasn't a neighborhood of people. It was a prison for those who dared to disturb the silence. The next morning, the silent neighborhood looked as it always did. Quiet, serene, untouched. But if you walked past Tom's house, you'd notice something peculiar. A figure stood by the window, staring out with empty, hollow eyes, silently watching anyone who dared to approach. And if you listened carefully, in the dead of night, you might hear a soft whisper, calling your name, inviting you into the silence. In an old, abandoned mansion on the edge of town, there's a room lined with mirrors. The place had been empty for years, sitting under layers of dust and rumors, until a young woman named Clara moved in. She wasn't afraid of the stories about the house, stories of strange noises and shadows that moved without a source. To her, it was just a big, empty house with too much history. She was an artist, always looking for inspiration, and this strange old place seemed like the perfect blank canvas. On her first day, she went exploring, wandering through rooms frozen in time. When she reached the top floor, she found a door slightly ajar, leading to the most peculiar room she'd ever seen. Every wall was covered with mirrors, floor to ceiling, without an inch uncovered. She stepped inside and her reflection surrounded her, a dozen Claras staring back from every direction. Curious, she walked to the center of the room, noticing how the mirrors distorted her slightly. Each reflection seemed just a little off. It wasn't just the angle or the lighting. It was something in the eyes of her reflections, something darker and almost alive. She shook off the feeling and chalked it up to her imagination. After all, who wouldn't feel strange in a room like this? Days went by and Clara grew accustomed to her new home. She painted by day, and at night she roamed the house, looking for inspiration. One evening, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It seemed to come from somewhere deep in the house. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the whisper continued, low and insistent, calling her name. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, she got out of bed and followed the sound. It led her once again to the mirror room. As she opened the door, she saw her reflection waiting for her. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't copying her movements. It stood perfectly still, its eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Clara took a step back, but her reflection stepped forward, closing the distance. She raised her hand, but her reflection didn't mirror her. Instead, it pressed its hand against the glass, as if it were trapped on the other side, desperate to escape. "Let me out," it whispered, its lips moving soundlessly. Clara felt her heart race, her body frozen in place as she watched her reflection's pleading eyes. She tried to turn, to run, but an invisible force seemed to hold her there, rooting her feet to the ground. "Please," the reflection whispered again, louder this time, her own voice twisted into something dark and foreign. "Let me out. I don't belong here." She couldn't look away, couldn't break free from the reflection's gaze. She realized, with growing horror, that the reflection wasn't just an image. It was something else, something alive, trapped on the other side of the glass. Without thinking, Clara reached out, pressing her hand against the mirror. As her fingers touched the cold glass, a strange sensation washed over her, a pulling, twisting feeling, like she was being sucked into the mirror itself. She tried to pull her hand back, but it was too late. The glass rippled beneath her touch, and she felt herself slipping forward into the reflection. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her reflection smiling, a cold, cruel smile that sent a chill through her entire body. When Clara opened her eyes, she was back in the mirror room, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in shadows, twisted and warped. And when she looked at the mirror, she saw herself on the other side, in her old world. Her reflection had taken her place. She banged on the glass, screaming, but her voice made no sound. She was trapped, her voice nothing but a hollow echo. She watched in horror as her reflection turned and left the room, leaving her alone in the dark, silent mirror world. Clara is still there, trapped in the endless reflections, a prisoner of the mirror room. Sometimes, if you're quiet enough, you can hear her whispering, begging to be set free. But anyone who enters that room and meets her gaze might find themselves in the same place she is, lost forever behind the glass, with a stranger walking free in their place.